Kendra. As she said, I go to Westfield State. I'm a double major in psychology and ethnic and gender studies. And I actually wrote this paper for my honors upper seminar class that I took last semester. And I was just really interested in it, so that's what I'm presenting. In the late 1800s, America was faced with something that should not be a problem, but it was indeed referred to as an issue, and that was the Indian problem. After taking most of their land, America was still not satisfied, and there was something about Native people which was that they did not fit into our civilized society. They were not conforming into our culture, in which it was actually not civilized at all, because it meant killing in the name of human progress. However, the Indians were a problem, and they were considered savages, and the solution would be to either kill them or educate them. Therefore, with slogans such as "Kill the Indian, Save the Man," boarding schools were created. What the natives did not expect was that there would be so maltreated in these schools. The treatment and neglect in the boarding schools were so bad that it led to most major psychological problems that Indians are still faced with today. These issues include, but are not limited to, alcoholism, substance abuse and dependence, disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety disorders, and personality disorders. History is to blame for a big portion of these problems, and the boarding school experience is what I will focus on, and as a reason of why Native Americans suffer from these psychological issues. According to Adams, in the early 1800th century, the government paid Christian organizations to open schools to educate children who did not have access to schools, especially in small towns. But in the late 1800s, they started using these schools for a different reason, to teach Native American children American standards by forgetting their native culture and by the lack of practice of their traditions or language. And then I have a quote from Dlugokinski. In the early years, efforts were directed towards eliminating the Indian cultures whose mere existence was a painful reminder of embarrassing incidents in American history. Regardless of the motivation, children were forbidden the privilege of speaking their own native language. Tribal traditions were ignored and downgraded, leaving the Indian child with little dignity and eroding pride in his heritage. The situation was absurd. These children were forced to leave their families and go live at a school where the environment was not comfortable. During the winter, it was constantly cold with no proper bathrooms. Food was another problem faced with by the Indians in the boarding schools. They did not know how to use utensils because they ate with their hands. The food itself was a new experience. Indians ate much different foods than the whites did. If all those obstacles weren't enough just to have a meal, Indians were also faced with the lack of food. Students reported being underfed or having to steal food. But of course, when they were caught in doing such a behavior, they would go through harsh punishment for having more food than another child. In the hopes of ripping any connection these children had with the native roots, steps were taken by the boarding schools. Their mission was to get rid of the savage in the native children and teach them civilized ways at the same time. The first step taken by the boarding schools towards civilization was to cut off the boys' hair. Authorities claimed that this would make the lice problem much simpler, but lice was not an overall problem to begin with. Therefore, we can conclude that cutting off the hair had a deeper meaning, and it did. The long hair gave the boys a look of savages, so it had to be cut off. However, the Native American boys, they had a much more significant, to them the hair was more significant than just looks, and numerous admitted to crying during the process of the hair cutting. Protests such as, if I'm to learn the ways of the white people, I can do it just as well with my hair on. These protests were common but useless. The motto of the first established Indian boarding school was to kill the Indian, save the man. As soon as the children go to school, they were forced to give their clothes and personal belongings up and were given the school uniform. They also had to change their names to American names. They would be beaten for speaking their native language and for practicing any of the native religions. Half of the school day consisted of religious studies, and the goal was to civilize the Indians so that they would forget their culture. And for the other half of the day, the teaching was different according to the sex of the child. For example, girls would take domestic arts. There have been many reports of physical abuse in the boarding schools, which were enforced by the government. Why? Because the atmosphere of these boarding schools were close to military and corporal punishment was common. Authorities knew about this kind of actions toward the students, and it was not banned. Instead, the rules were added to keep it under control. And then I have a quote from Adams. By 1890, the official position of the government was that corporal punishment should be resorted to only in the case of grave violation of the rules. Just about any negative behavior performed by the Indian students was punished in a physical way. The situation in these boarding schools were anything but comfortable, and considering our first world country standards, these conditions were not even acceptable living conditions. Today, boarding schools are run by the tribes, therefore all aspects of the culture are embraced, including the culture, all of the traditions, the religion, and the language. But just like any other teenager, Indians also suffer a more severe stage in life where they're more depressed than they'll ever be. Despite that, in a later study, girls in white and black adolescent samples reported the highest rates of depression scores. Indian female teenagers living in boarding schools run by the native tribes, of course, are happier than the average American female teenagers of these two ethnicities. That was the conclusion made of the study for Mason. And then we have the Two-Spirit Native tribes. They have specific beliefs towards sexual orientation. They believe in a diverse sexes and different sexual identities, and that lesbians, gays, bisexual, or transgender are two-spirited and have important cultural roles in their community. However, this belief was rapidly challenged when missionaries and state officials were sent to boarding schools and assigned gender roles according to sexes. This belief that every person needs to be in a specific gender role came from the Christianity that was being taught at the boarding schools. This kind of struggle with sexuality led to different confusion and even mental health issues. Following that sort of judgmental environment, it was devastating to acknowledge that two-spirited people, more specifically Indian and Alaskan natives, which are also known as AN, have the highest rate of mental health disorders in the United States. 14% of them reported distress, being that the general population percent is 8. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also higher at 22% compared to other adults at 8%. AN people tend to drink earlier, drink in more quantity and frequency, and experience more alcohol-related consequences than any other group. Because of that, natives' deaths are 5 times more prone to being associated to alcohol than non-natives. At 18%, ANs have the highest rate of illicit drug use in contrast to any other ethnic group, and also the highest percentage at 11% of being dependent in those drugs. And that was a study by Evans Campbell. Among those participants which attended the boarding schools, their average age when entering the boarding school was 10, and the average years spent in the boarding school was 3.8 years. 42.7% of those participants rated their experience as poor, 24% as neutral, and 18% were sent to the boarding schools against their parents' will. 40.6% reported not being able to practice any of their native traditions while being in the boarding schools. Since the process of civilization required new religion beliefs, 45.1% reported being expected to go to Christian school as a big part of this civilization process was getting rid of the native language. 63% reporting being commanded not to speak their native language. 34% of these attendees reported being physically abused. 29.3% reported being sexually abused while attending the boarding schools. Those who were raised by parents that attended a boarding school, 66.5% reported that their parents were physically abused, and 18.8% reported that their parents were sexually abused. With that information above, it's not surprising that substance abuse among Asians that attended boarding schools are so much higher than any other ethnic group. 58.5% of them reported having an alcohol problem or dependency versus 44%, which is the overall general adults. 65.4% reported having used illicit drugs more than once last year versus only 48%, which is still a high percentage, but when you compare it to 65, there's a big difference. 92% reported using narcotics versus 51%. So you go from 92 to 51. And 78% reported using club drugs last year more than once versus 38%. So we have 78 in natives and then 38 for general adults. When it comes to mental health, the statistics do not get any more promising. 92% reported having suicidal thoughts versus 88%, and 75% reported trying to commit suicide versus 53%. Participants who were raised by parents that attend boarding schools were also more likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, 48.9%, versus those who were not raised by parents that were boarding school attendees, 36%. They were also more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, 90% versus 83%. Finally, just like our participants that attended boarding schools, their children were also more likely to have suicidal thoughts, 90% versus 83%, which was the same percentage of post-traumatic stress disorder for the children of the parents that went to the boarding schools. And that entire study was also done by Evans Campbell. After all those statistics, we can clearly see the effects that boarding schools had not only on those who attended it, but also on their children. And then I have a quote. Research indicates that the impact of major traumatic events may persist for generations, and that the trauma can manifest in poor mental depression and physical health in later generations. It is evident that those who attended boarding schools are significantly more depressed, proven by rates in which they experience suicidal thoughts and attempting it, compared to the overall adult population. Also, their children's rates of suicidal thoughts is higher than natives that did not attend boarding schools and other ethnic groups. Also, other disorders such as anxiety disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder had higher rates for boarding school attendees and their children. Finally, substance abuse such as alcohol, illicit drugs, and club drugs were much more likely to be abused and even causing death in native and non-natives.